You're listening to Saturday Morning Media. And now, back to our show. I have a lot of really cool friends who do a lot of really cool things. I wanted to make it a goal to sit down with these friends and spend about 15 minutes or so getting to know them better and find out about their past, present, and their future. The result is this show. My name is Grant Baciocco, and this is 15 Minutes With. J. Elvis Weinstein is a director, a writer, a comedian, and he is today's guest on 15 Minutes With. J. Elvis, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Now, you grew up in Minnesota, right?
I did, yes.
And growing up there, what was the kind of the first creative thing that you got into, even as a kid?
I was like very into any opportunity to perform as a kid. I wasn't like if there was a talent day, if there was a talent show. It was usually music back then.
Uh-huh.
But you know, I don't know. I was always sort of I always had some creative pursuit as a kid, and sometimes it would be like, you know, me sitting behind keyboards and playing music or guitar. It was always, I dabbled in a ton of different instruments, and you know, I just was always making something as a kid.
Yeah, and was that started at a very young age?
Yeah, pretty young.
Yeah, and did your parents like give you lessons and stuff, or did you just figure it out on your own?
You know, I hated lessons,
really?
and I still do.
Yeah.
I'm just a dilettante by nature. You know, I just kind of jump in and see what I can do, and if I don't have an aptitude for it, I tend to move on fairly quickly.
And were you writing songs, or were you kind of like playing covers of?
No, I was both.
Both, yeah.
I was writing songs. You know, I was very much of that. You know, there wasn't a lot of I can't do that in me as a kid.
Right. And were your parents supportive?
Yeah, very supportive. They weren't hovering at all.
Yeah.
But they were, you know, they indulged me.
And
lessons were available if I wanted them for anything. And I took various music lessons, but I never I'm not a disciplined dude.
Yeah. And did this when you were going out and performing at these you know, events, the talent shows and whatever, were you finding success?
Yeah, you know,
people liked what you were doing.
Yeah, I got positive reinforcement for. I mean, no one was ever like, "You're a star, baby." You know,
Right.
It was all sort of self-generated. I wasn't being egged on by anyone. It was just like I liked having an audience, and generally, you know, I liked to get a laugh from that audience. I would try to be funny in the context of whatever I was doing.
So were your songs humorous as well?
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah. And did you, when you got into like, say, high school and stuff, were you in a band? I was in musicals for a bit, but I started doing stand-up when I was 15, and then everything else just went away. Yeah, and what inspired you to get into stand-up? Just that love?
I kind of always thought I was. I always associated myself with it as a kid for some reason. Mm-hmm. I think, you know, laughter was like a big deal in my house. Like, laughter was the highest form of approval.
Right.
My brother and I were both like gifted kids in quotes, and we both skipped a grade, and you know, we were both, you know, we were highly visible kids, but you know, the thing that you could tell, like, you know, when my parents were bragging about us on the phone, it was about something funny we said, not something we did, you know. And so, you know, and it was a high bar in my house. It's like it was a pretty classy comedy, you know. Like, you could change the mood of anything in my family with a good joke.
Right.
Like, you could lighten the mood with a solid joke. You could wipe any bad feeling out. But the other side of that sword is a bad joke or an ill-timed joke could inflame the situation.
Right.
So, you know, so it was a very honest room.
Right.
You know?
Right.
But my mom was a great laugher, you know, and you could get my mom to pee her pants if you got her going enough, you know. So.
Yeah. And so you decided to turn pro at a very young age.
I did, and I assume, you know, had nothing to do with, you know, my parents had no, like, you should be a comedian. There was never any of that.
Yeah.
What happened was my friend Barry Golob, who was 16 and I was 15, he was like, we were hanging out one Saturday night, and he was like, I'm going to go do this open stage tomorrow night at a place called the Ha Ha Club, which had no liquor license. I said, oh, well, I'll come with you and do it too. I just really totally invited myself along. And 6 months later, he was done, and I was like completely hooked.
Hooked on fire.
I mean, I was hooked that night. But
yeah.
But I wasn't like a kid who like filled up notebooks hoping, you know, I literally like decided I'd do it the next night and then wrote my act 2 hours before the show and did it. And, you know, maybe, you know, 25% of the jokes landed, and that was enough, you know.
Right. Right. And then, so after that, you just started doing clubs around Minneapolis and stuff?
Pretty much. I stayed at the Ha Ha Club for several months, and that's where I met Joel Hodgson. And he taught. He had just sort of come back from a couple years of self-imposed exile from stand-up, right as I was starting. This was 1987. And he taught this sort of stand-up and creativity class, which I took because I was a big fan of his from his Letterman appearances and Saturday Night Live stuff as a prop comic.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we became friends. And then within that year, I started playing the other clubs in town and with liquor licenses. And for some reason, even though I was a kid, I mean, first of all, I didn't, if you see Mystery Science Theater that I was on, that's about how I looked, so it doesn't scream teenager, just like fat guy. So like there wasn't, me being a teenager wasn't an issue in my stand-up at all. It's like I didn't talk about it on stage at all, and I didn't, and the other stand-ups treated me as a peer, like shockingly quickly. So I just like found this world that was like, oh God, this is it. This is where I should be.
Yeah.
I mean, the bartenders at the clubs would pour me scotch into a coffee cup when I'd walk in, and it was like, so I just was like, I had it wired very young, and it was very exciting.
Yeah. When you were doing stand-up, did you do any road stuff?
I did. Starting when I was 16, I started going on the road during like spring break and summer break from school. I did my first road trip ever was when I was 16. It was with Trace Beaulieu, who was on Mystery Science Theater as well. And we did Worthington, Minnesota, Faribault, Minnesota, Beulah, North Dakota, Flandreau, South Dakota, and Mobridge, South Dakota.
Wow.
Places I had never heard of before or since.
I haven't heard of till now.
But somehow I convinced my mom to let my 16-year-old ass go play bars in the Dakotas.
Yeah.
With two guys she didn't know, so... That was all because my dad, who died when I was young, was about 22, but that was all my dad's doing was, just this. He had this sort of thing like, well, if this kid has the wherewithal to actually get these gigs in the Dakotas, you got to let him go,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and so you mentioned, kind of being inspired by Joel Hodgson and, or look up to him, admire him. Did you ever, from your time working with Joel, have a piece of advice that kind of has stuck with you working with Joel?
No, not. I mean, I think in that class, I think the things that I really took away with was shedding the idea of the audience as adversary. Mm-hmm. Getting the idea that the audience actually wants you to succeed and that they're just sort of an unorganized group of people seeking leadership, essentially,
Oh, right.
But I don't know. I mean, I think Joel would admit now that he was sort of out of his depth teaching the class at that time, but he was someone who was successful and who I liked, but
yeah.
He and I always, I think he and I always had different skill sets,
Mm-hmm.
But it was the encouragement at that stage by him, and we became friends, and then, he joined a writing group that I was in with other comics, and, we would write together sometimes, and, I think I resisted any sort of real mentorship,
right?
Which I think eventually became a problem between he and I. But definitely having the validation of someone, encouraging me and kind of going, "You can do anything,"
right.
was pretty big at that time. And then,
so you mentioned taking a writing class, and I know you're a writer now. Were you just writing stand-up, or were you trying to write
it was
other
just
things?
stand-up.
Just stand-up.
Yeah.
And so when you got asked to join up to work on Mystery Science Theater back at KTMA, was that something you just jumped on right away? You're just like, yeah, sure, I'll do this, or?
Yeah, it wasn't. I mean, it wasn't anything when he asked. Like I said, we had this writing group, which a bunch of local stand-ups, we'd get together once a week in this library basement room, and just dump notebooks on each other, and try to punch up jokes for each other. And Joel started coming to that, and then one day after the session, he asked Trace and I, "Hey, I'm doing this thing tomorrow at KTMA with puppets, and do you want to come help?" And it was really that. I mean,
yeah.
And so, of course, yes, we'll come help.
Sure.
And it was like literally we showed up, and there was a couple of puppets there, and we each grabbed one, and mine turned into Servo eventually, but at first it was called Beeper.
Right.
We shot a pilot, and it was always this incredibly casual thing. But yeah, I mean, when we just started making it, really.
Just started doing it.
And I think that's the other thing that I took away from Joel is the value of just making stuff. You know, is rather than not everything's going to hold up to a pitch process. You know, like Mystery Science Theater, without us having done the KTMA shows, they couldn't have gone to Comedy Central and gone, "Hey, we got the show. We're 2 puppets and a guy." You know, you had to see it.
Right.
So it was a lot of things lined up for that show to work, and the fact that we had this UHF station that no one really gave a crap about what was going on there to start and have as our lab, you know, and do a 2-hour improv show once a week, you know, that was necessary for that, all of those things to line up, I think.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to go too much into Mystery Science Theater because I think that's well covered, and if people want to look at it, they can go on the internet and do so. But when you left Mystery Science Theater, was that like hard? Was that a hard decision for you?
It was a hard. It was a hard time. It wasn't. It wasn't fully my decision. You know, it was very much a mutual. We were done with each other.
Okay.
At that point, so it was a hard time, and it was hard. What had led up to it was like. You know, it was a little bit soul crushing for me.
Right.
But it wasn't, you know, the decision was easy. You know, it was either I'm leaving or you're firing me. You know, it was, and kind of both happened. It was really very much a mutual kind of like, I think it's time. Yeah.
So when you left that, what was after you took a deep breath, what was the next course of action for you?
Next course of action was go back to stand-up where I was being treated like an adult and a peer instead of, you know, an ungrateful 18-year-old.
Yeah.
And that's what I did for the next couple of years. I just went on the road, and I worked on a show that was on the Ha Network, that was done out of Minneapolis called Access America, which starred Fred Willard, and it was like it was basically America's Funniest Home Videos, but with cable access stuff. Not very good, but you know, it was another gig,
right?
And then I moved out here to Los Angeles when I was 20. Like the year before that, I think I did 40 weeks on the road just to save up money.
Yeah.
And then moved out here, and you know, with the stated intent of getting a writing job and the sort of less stated intent of being a star as a stand-up.
Man, doing 40 weeks on the road, I would think that prepares you for anything in the world of stand-up, is that 40 weeks.
Well, it prepared me for everything but L.A., unfortunately. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it made it so I had this act that worked fine on the road, but when I got here to town, I just had this pile of shit that I didn't feel like I could stand behind, you know?
Yeah.
And I was 20 years old, and I was a really good joke writer, but I really didn't have my adulthood, my full self on stage yet. So, you know, as soon as I got a writing job, I kind of backed away from stand-up for a while, and it was I regretted doing it, kind of. You know, I always regret when I'm away from stand-up for any length of time.
Yeah.
But I came here, and it was either the like hardcore improv comics, and I didn't have that kind of powerful 10-minute set. I had built the set that was more of conversational over the course of 45 minutes.
Right.
Or it was the alternative comedy scene, who were all just these people spilling their guts out of their notebooks, you know.
Yeah.
And I didn't have enough guts at that point to spill, you know. I didn't have demons, and I didn't. Again, like I said, I didn't really have my full sense of self on stage at that point. So I just felt like I just felt like I didn't have the chops to be an LA comic despite having been on the road for 40 weeks.
Right.
It's like I could go into a weird room in Missouri and do fine, but the 10-minute set was like a different skill that I didn't quite have.
Yeah, well, I think that even now it seems that if you get, I don't know, 20, 30 miles outside of Los Angeles, you can have a great show. You know what I mean? Like, it's a completely different audience. It's a different room, a different atmosphere.
It is, yeah. It's more of a traditional thing. Or even if you go to Burbank, that Flappers room in Burbank, that you had me in a show, that's much more like a road room.
Right.
Than the Improv is.
Yeah.
Or, you know.
So you mentioned you got a writing gig. What was the writing gig on?
The first thing I did when I came out here was, for the first couple of years, I wrote stuff for Louis Anderson, and I wrote some stuff for Roseanne, and I was writing stand-up, and then going back on the road and trying to get writing gigs. The first TV gig I got was an A&E special that was kind of Daily Show like. It was like a year in review news thing, and it started a guy named Will Durst, who's a longtime political comic. Yeah. And then shortly after that, I got on Talk Soup with Greg Kinnear, and then like a week later, he hired me on Later with Greg Kinnear on NBC.
And what was that like, going from stand-up? I mean, I know it's a lot of stand-ups write on shows like that, but to go from, I'm going out on the road, to all of a sudden now you're in a writer's room.
I didn't mind it. It was good. I mean, it was good making, really good money, and it was good, it was what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a TV writer, and so it was actually a great entry-level TV writer thing, because it was jokes, and it wasn't, you didn't have to, I didn't have to learn story structure, and I didn't have to learn where the act break goes. It was mostly just jokes. And with Kinnear, it was a lot of mocking video, which I was adept at,
Right.
His opening monologue was what they called the video log, and he would it would be him reacting to news clips, essentially, like he did on Talk Soup.
Right.
And then I became head writer. After a year, I decided I wanted to get out of there, and I said I was going to leave, and they offered me the head writer job, and so I did the head writer job.
Yeah, and then kind of continuing that making fun of video, you also worked on America's Funniest Home Videos.
I did.
As well.
Yes.
And was that was after that?
That was after that, yeah.
Yeah, and
I went and did a sitcom for a year, and then I did America's Funniest Home Videos, and I was really I was such a dick when I because I didn't want the job. This was as head writer, and they had just gotten rid of Bob Saget, and I thought I was too hip for the room, really, and went in there and I was like, yeah, the show's great and the videos are great, but everyone I know who likes it watches it muted. They can't take the thing, and blah 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 blah, and they were like, okay, yeah, whatever you want to do. So I was like, all right,
okay.
So and in fact, aside from the cosmetics of the show, which were sort of beyond my control, and what was important to Vin DeBona, the executive producer of the show, I got to do an actual comedy show for a couple of years.
Yeah.
Because it was on Saturday night then, and it was on a little later, so I could even do non-family style jokes, and and it was a good experience, and it was completely invisible from show business, except the one person who was watching that I found out was Judd Apatow. And because then I went to Freaks and Geeks after those 2 years at America's Funniest Home Videos, and the only person ever in show business who had noticed the work I did on that show was Judd, because he had just had a baby and was home on Saturday nights with the baby, and he gave me this litany of things he liked that I did and how I didn't force things, and so that was part of why I got the gig on Freaks and Geeks.
And what was your role on Freaks and Geeks?
I was a producer and writer.
Yeah. And it's funny because you were a part of Mystery Science Theater, which is kind of a cult show,
right.
Cult following, and Freaks and Geeks I kind of see as the same way, has a big cult following.
Yeah, I have weird nerd cred.
Yeah, so if you want a cult show, hire J. Elvis.
Absolutely.
But what was Freaks and Geeks like? Because it was a fantastic show.
Freaks and Geeks was a pretty great experience in the sense of seeing the experience of doing dramatic, hour-long drama at its best, really, in the sense of everyone cared. Everyone in every department cared about what they were doing, and everyone was trying to up their game and bring their own personal thing to the table, and it was just a show where you saw that everyone was putting so much into it and so proud of the fact that what was coming out the other end was worth being proud of.
Yeah,
that's not always the case in TV.
Well, and it seems that it worked because so many people came out of that show. I know people were around before that show started, but it just seems like you look through there and you go, oh, that's all these people from all these different shows, movies now. The thing that I think, Judd is primarily, Judd's greatest talent is his eye for talent. Yeah.
I don't mean to diminish anything else he does, but he has a tremendous eye for talent.
Yeah.
And that casting process for that show, along with Paul Feig and Jake Kasdan, who also were highly involved in the pilot, Paul wrote it. The casting was painstaking for that show. It was, they were all over the country and Canada, and really trying to find interesting kids that were real.
Yeah. And I want to talk about in more recent years, you've been directing films.
Yes.
But was that something? Did you always like? I always wanted. What I really want to do is direct. Was that what it always was? Or
Well, I mean, what I really am is a control freak, you know. And what I found with TV is that eventually the only job I wanted was showrunner. You know, and I did a few pilots over a few years, and didn't work out. But no, you know, I've realized that I'm only happy when I'm making something, you know, and I'm quickly unhappy when I'm not. And so I've made these 2 documentaries. I'm finishing the second one now. And, you know, it is, you know, it was a way to make movies. You know, it was a way to sort of sidestep a lot of process and just get to the making of the thing, you know, and learn how to make movies, you know. And, you know, what I've realized about myself is you just can't pay me enough to be bored, you know, and that's kind of the only guiding force I've had in my career, because I've done every kind of TV, you know. I've done, as we talked about, talk show, sitcom, hour-long, half-hour single camera, variety show, which is basically what you know, AFV is, and created another clip show for FX called Fast Food Films, and you know, so I'd done like every kind of TV. And so to me, it's like, if I'm not learning something, or you know, getting a new skill, or getting something new from doing a project, I get bored really quick, and at a certain point, it feels dishonest, you know, to be pursuing it further.
So your first documentary was about Michael DeBar, and what was the decision to make that your topic and go with that?
You know, for me, it's like, if I can see the story and feel like I have a way to tell it that's, you know, has some insight, then I'm interested in doing it. You know, I'm not like a natural storyteller, but I'm a natural organizer of information, I think. Right. You know, so I had actually met Michael working on one of the sitcoms I worked on. Actually, we cast him two years in a row. He played sort of a rock star type, which he is.
Yeah.
And he's had this incredibly, you know, crazy long and diverse career, you know, much more glamorous than mine, but similar in that way, where he's been, you know, he's had record deals and movies and TV shows, and you know, does all these things, you know, much all in front of the camera. But so I was, you know, so I met him, found him really interesting, working with him on set, and we talked actually about doing a book. And so I did several hours of interviews with him, and this was back around 2001. And then we realized neither of us really wanted to write a book all that much, and so it kind of died off. But I always kind of regretted that. I still think this guy has a pretty great story, and a worthwhile story in some ways. So I ran into him like 10 years later, actually doing someone's podcast, and you know, I saw him, and I was like, my head was like, you know, why did we think we should write a book instead of making a documentary? And I really would like to make a doc. And he's like, well, yeah, okay. And literally within 3 weeks we were shooting.
Yeah. And where can people go if they want to check out?
Right now I'm still dealing with some music issues. So
okay.
I went out on the festival circuit. I won Best in Show at the Macon Film Festival, and did San Francisco Doc Fest, and did Don't Knock the Rock here in town at the Silent Movie Theater. Mm-hmm. But then realized that music rights were going to be a bigger issue than I thought, and so I kind of pulled it back, and now I'm dealing with that and hoping to still get it out.
Yeah. And your current documentary is about comedy in Asia?
Yes. It's called I Need You to Kill, and it's about stand-up in Asia, both following some American comics doing it over there for the first time, as well as exploring these stand-up, English-speaking stand-up scenes that are popping up all over Asia right now.
And how long were you over in Asia filming that?
12 days. 12
days?
Yeah. And so I was it's sort of framed around this actual tour that these guys took.
Right. And did you yourself do stand-up?
I did a couple of sets, yeah.
Yeah.
I wasn't part of the tour, but I had to do a few sets, yeah.
Was that were there any similarities to some small town in South Dakota?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, it was actually, but shockingly similar to a city in America, too. You know, it's the world is very small now when it comes to information and reference points, you know.
Yeah.
CNN goes around the globe, and in American movies and TV, and not that I'm so reference based in my stand up, but it didn't feel very foreign,
Right. And as we wrap up here, I just want to ask: do you write every day? Do you try to?
I don't write every day. I work every day. But I write jokes for Twitter, and I write a lot of jokes actually for Twitter. But
right.
I don't really write them for Twitter. I think of them and go, throw it on Twitter. I never compose Twitter tweets.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because you're very active on Twitter, and so Twitter, and you're put out a lot of jokes a day, it seems, on Twitter. Is that has that worked for you? Do you think that's a great outlet for you?
It's better than the thoughts going into the ether.
Yeah,
because that's the option, really.
Right.
I'm not doing that much stand up, so I have to save them. I have to jot them down in a notebook and save them. I'd rather get them to. I have a bigger audience on Twitter than most stand up rooms.
Right.
But it's not a deliberate pursuit so much as. I don't sit down to tweet. Right. I just have these thoughts come through my head, and rather than letting them pass through, I just dump them. I redirect them to my Twitter feed.
To your Twitter feed, yeah.
And obviously you have to phrase them in a way that fits into the thing. But joke writing is, that's a muscle that is highly developed at this point. So
right.
It's not. They say W.C. Fields, who started off as a juggler, juggled every day for the rest of his life just because he was paranoid that he'd have to go back to it.
Right.
So I think it's kind of my juggling. I feel like if I had to, I could go back and be on a talk show staff.
Right.
With my joke chops.
Yeah. Have you ever? I don't know what made me think to ask this, but have you ever put out a joke that, that people they'll tweet something and then it seems the whole internet has come down on them? And I know that maybe that necessarily hasn't happened to you, but have you ever tweeted something that just got a horrible reaction from Twitter?
I can't remember what they are really.
Yeah.
I think I did. There's been a couple where I deleted them just because I was like, oh no, that's not really what I want to represent to the world.
Right.
I don't have any hard fast rules about the integrity of my feed, or every thought is in cement.
Yeah.
There was one where I sort of belittled I think the Unknown Soldier, or the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, or it was something that just didn't give it proper respect.
Right.
And there was a couple of service people who were like, "Dude, that's not cool," and I was like, "Dude, you're right."
Right.
And so I don't know. I'm not looking for fights at all. I'm not. Right. To me, a good, the best joke is one that can make even an opponent of the idea laugh and give it up that it's a good joke.
Yeah.
But I'm not friends of mine who are, looking for fights and who are energized by fighting. I'm totally the opposite. That's the Minnesotan in me does not like head-on conflict without any art to it.
Right. Well, if people want to check out your Twitter feed or find you online, where can they go?
At Elvis Weinstein is the best way in.
All right. Well, I will put a link to that in the show notes. And J. Elvis, thank you so much for coming by the show today.
Thanks. It was fun. Sorry I wasn't funny.
You were funny. This episode's guest, J. Elvis Weinstein, is a director, a writer, and a comedian. And you can connect with him on Twitter, where his username is J. Elvis Weinstein. Also, check out the website for his documentary on Michael DeBar called Who Do You Want Me to Be? Over at www.mdbmovie.com. 15 Minutes With on the GrantCast is a production of Saturday Morning Media and is made possible by the Saturday Morning Media Patreon patrons who've gone to patreon.com/Saturday Morning Media and set up a monthly donation for as little as $1 a month. Huge thanks to Shay Stewart, Merle Lafferty, Jeff Peterson, Dale Gadania, Steven Staver, Jackie Klimo, Melissa Crawford, Chuck, Matthew Wayne Selznick, Dave Slesher of the Evil Genius Chronicles, Mike Coughlin, Dorothy Baciocco, John D., Kathy Crawford, Brian Greer, Kerry Whitney, Chuck Tomasi, Chris Foster, Stephen Ing, Clinton of ComedyForecast.com, Vicky DeVries, Mike Wobschall, Twitter user Buttsinggear, a.k.a. Wildcat, Eve Cunning, Mike Hamilton, and Gaston Moreno. If you'd like to support this show and the other fun content from Saturday Morning Media, become a patron. Head on over to patreon.com/Saturday Morning Media today and set up your donation. Or you can tell a friend about the show or leave the show a review on iTunes. If you have feedback for the show, you can send it directly to me at grant@throwingtoasters.com or get in touch via Twitter, where my username is ToasterBoy. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll talk to you next time. The GrantCast is copyright 2016 Saturday Morning Media, Grant Baciocco, executive producer. All rights reserved. www.saturdaymorningmedia.com. Elf-Centered is a monthly, completely improvised broadcast from Santa's Village. Join elves Gavin, Beatrice, and Gary as they talk about the latest goings-on from the North Pole. He has a pass to the radio station.
I know, but he's got to go through the security check.
Well, he'll be fine.
Okay.
You know Gary, drop of a hat, he'll strip down to his jingle shoes.
That's what we're worried about.
Oh.
He's been red-nosed.
Really?
Yes, he has. He
Oh,
has.
no.
Well,
subscribe to Elf-Centered. Visit elfcenteredshow.com today. You've been listening to Saturday Morning Media. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.